complex stuff. It's an attempt to insert the UN into global discussions around technology, around climate change, or to reinsert in a fashion that is updated, that is multi-stakeholder, and that enables discussions between developing and high-income countries, I think. That's how I would characterize it. And obviously a lot of that relates to technology, though not all of it. So one piece of this is the Global Digital Compact. This flowed out of the Pact for the Future, and it articulates various positive duties that might, that should be imposed on countries and on non-state actors to, I guess you would say, bring together a more equitable future for technology in general. So we're not just talking about the internet, because the UN has a strong record, obviously, with WSIS and with the IGF, but to go beyond that, to think about AI in particular. And the reason that we started to come together in the working group last week was to start thinking about data governance as an important basis for a lot of these other functions, and about how to do data governance on a multi-stakeholder basis, which is obviously a huge challenge.
Absolutely. And if we think about the other objectives of the GDC, seems to me that objective number 4 plays a crucial role in terms of achieving these other objectives too. What do you think about that?
It seems to, yeah. I mean, a lot of what the Global Digital Compact wants to achieve cannot be done without, I'm trying not to use the word improving around data governance, but rethinking data governance to be more inclusive and to be less focused on, I would say, data as an asset, basically data as a tradable commodity that circulates in markets. What's interesting to me about the Global Digital Compact is that it goes way beyond the notion of commodifiable data to data as a source and a feature of sovereignty, data as a source and feature of and tool of development, data as a political object, data as, to some extent, labor as well, and something I've always been interested in, data as bodies, data as community, data as relationships. So it definitely incorporates data as an economic good, but it goes far beyond that. And that's why I think also this is going to be a struggle to understand each other's positions in the working group, and a struggle to come out with a consensus in really interesting ways, because those features of data and of data governance are not the easiest to reach agreement on, I would say.
It's quite a comprehensive and forward-looking approach to it. And data has been discussed in other bodies as well, the G7, the OECD, the G20. But what is the importance, you think, of placing this subject at the UN level?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I think two things. One is that doing this within the UN and through the UN offers a different layer and a different way to think about data governance, because currently we have what you might term an emergent framework for global data governance, which is coming out of organizations including the G20, the G7, the WTO, various very high-level organizations. The World Economic Forum has been very active in pushing for the global governance of data. The UN has a long track record in thinking about how to do interoperability around the SDGs. And the Digital Compact is obviously very much oriented towards this as well. So we have sort of a global governance acquis, you might say, for data. But it's not very coherent, other than that it treats data as an economic good. And then data is actually concretely governed on the national level, and to some extent on the regional level, for instance, by the EU. And there we see regulation which stipulates what you cannot do with data, but doesn't stipulate a lot of positive duties. And so I think the virtue of engaging with this on the UN level is that you can relate it more clearly to human rights. You can relate it more clearly to existing international agreements, and to agreements which prioritize the development of low and middle income countries. And so I think it opens windows where regulation tends to try to close them often.
Yeah, Absolutely, and that's a fascinating discussion, which puts development at the center that has been lacking in other spaces for sure. And this comprehensive view of data as more than an economic resource, which is missing in other forums such as the WTO. But let's zoom into the work of the group a little bit more. The group itself. How was this group formed? For those who have not been following the process closely, who are its members,
Yeah.
and what did the UN ask this group to deliver exactly?
So there's a fairly large group of states from Africa, Asia Pacific, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and Western Europe, and other states, including the US. So those are the governmental stakeholders. But then, interestingly, there are also a lot of UN bodies, obviously, because most UN bodies are implicated in some way by data governance. So we have organizations like the FAO, UNICEF, UNHCR. There's a long list. I think there's about 20 UN bodies or more. And then we have representatives from academia, the business community, civil society, and the technical community. And we had to apply to join the working group. So we all wrote statements about what we see as the value of the working group, how our background and experience might contribute to its mandate and to what it needs to do. And I think there was just a process of selection on the part of the CSTD, the Committee on Science and Technology and Development. And some of us were invited in.
So the group held its first meeting on the 1st and the 2nd of May. And we know that these inaugural groups are usually dedicated to more operational issues, how the group itself is going to function. And could you tell us perhaps a little bit more about the agenda of this meeting, what the group expected to do, and what were the main outcomes of this conversation that happened on the 1st of May? I feel sorry for you working on the 1st of May, the holiday.
A lot of people mentioned that it was a national holiday for them. One person, it was also his birthday, so we were very happy to get to have him there. Yeah, so we all got to sit in a basement together in Geneva on the 1st of May with beautiful weather outside. But it was worth it because it was fascinating. So to go back to your earlier question, we're dealing with Objective 4 of the Global Digital Compact, which involves responsible, equitable, and interoperable data governance, which sounds simple and bounded until you get everyone together to try to discuss it, obviously. So I would say we had about 50 people in the room, I think. And some were observers who were interested observers because they work on data governance already, and they were obviously very welcome. Some are UN bodies also. And we started off with an agenda that said we're going to try to set our terms of reference, which comes out of Article 48 of the Global Digital Compact. But the group is a little more complex than that. Obviously, we need to start digging down into what we mean by responsible and equitable and interoperable data governance. So we needed a terms of reference and we needed a plan of work. And that was the objective for the first 2 days. And that sounds simple, but what we actually got into was a discussion that was much more one about substance. And it was about whose interests would be in play, to what extent we can be multi-stakeholder about the question of data governance at present, given the interests that are in play, and the amount, particularly the amount economically that is at stake for a lot of different actors. So what we did for 2 days was really discuss the notion of multi-stakeholderism and how you can do that when you think about data governance currently.
What really struck me about this group, well, first of all, I was part of other CSTD working groups before the CSTD working group on IGF improvements, and I also assisted the CSTD working group on enhanced cooperation. So what fascinated me about this group is the level of openness that was achieved with time, because as an observer, I had access to the documents that you were discussing in the room. To me, it was a level of openness that was kind of unprecedented, and I think we should really appreciate the chair, Mr. Peter Major, for that, because he's really making sure that observers can participate and have access to the positions that are being shared in the room, many times on paper, and we know that as remote participants it's not a very easy to have access to that. But also the fact that the chair was optimistic in the sense like he felt that there was some agreement already on the TOR, because the TOR repeated so much language that was coming from the GDC itself. And when I saw the first item of the agenda was actually more forward-looking, as if almost a TOR would not be a big issue, but then members of the group raised the point, no, we want to discuss the TOR and the text that is there. How did you see this shift happen?
Well, I mean, I think time is the best explanation for that shift. I think that when the Global Digital Compact was agreed, a lot of states had a different administration in place. And so almost everybody will have had a change of administration since then in some way or other. And with that change in administration, obviously come political and policy changes that rearrange priorities. And so even though the GDC was agreed and a lot of states signed on to it, that doesn't mean that the meaning of data governance to those states is exactly what it was when the GDC was first agreed. So I think the first 2 days were completely reasonably spent wrestling over the idea of data governance and what it should and should not encompass. Because, for instance, the idea of responsible and equitable, does that mean a top-down process where one group of powerful actors decides what constitutes responsible and equitable governance? Or does it have to be bottom-up or like horizontal? Right? The notion of interoperability as well, which seems to be the least controversial part of the terms of reference. And that is the major focus of Objective 4 of the Global Digital Compact. Even that, interoperability of what? Because you have interoperability of data per se, right? It all gets much easier when you just talk about data as an object and not what kind of data, whose data, data for what, right? And if you talk about data for the SDGs, there's a level on which we can talk about how great it would be to have fully interoperable statistical data between states. Right? But where does that statistical data even come from? It's going to come to some extent from the private sector. It's going to come from, for instance, mobile phone companies. It's going to come from all sorts of actors who may not have quite the same interests as states. And so even when we talk about something as relatively uncontroversial as interoperability, as soon as we get into the question of interoperability of what, we're going to find that people have very different positions in the room.
Exactly, and that was clear, and also a sort of a tension between those that seem to really want to get to the core of the issues and that made substantive proposals on what the working groups should tackle, and those that were still discussing the procedural issues like the TOR and how the group is going to operate and what kind of deliverable this group can be expected to reach. So in your view, what were the main sticky points or conflicts of view in the room?
Yeah, so I think multi-stakeholderism kept coming back, what we actually mean by that. Do we mean that those who already have possession of a lot of data and have the infrastructures to manage data will be doing the governance and everyone else gets to listen and learn? Or do we mean that we want to make governance more horizontal? That we want to create duties for the most powerful to distribute data, to manage data, also for the benefit of the less powerful? And if so, how would we enforce that? And on whom? Who becomes responsible? So there's some very big questions in there of international relations and politics, which is why, I mean, I don't think we got stuck, which is why we spent the whole 2 days talking about the terms of reference and the working plan, because that goes to the heart of the substance of the group. Because out of that come very different suggestions for what might belong in an advice to the UN General Assembly in 2026, 2027. So that for me was the most interesting part. For instance, the issue of consensus. So we discussed quite a bit whether the views of the working group or the decisions of the working group should be by consensus, or where people radically disagree or where people cannot quite get to a consensus, whether that dissensus should then be reported and become part of the proceedings of the working group and part of what we report back. And that, I think, is an eternal question in international relations. How much does it matter if certain interests cannot be aligned, right? And what do we do with what is left out of the picture? I think there is one scenario where the working group really focuses in hard on interoperability and on commercial forms of data, and where consensus is much easier to achieve. And there's another scenario at the other end of the spectrum where we go all out on the SDGs and on interoperability to do with development, which includes things like funding and technical assistance for those who don't yet have the infrastructures to make things interoperable, right? So those for me are the two ends of the spectrum, one of which plays very much to the interests of current data holders, such as large platforms, such as states who house big tech, you know, who house the headquarters of big tech. And then the other end of the spectrum is really about democratizing, about making governance more horizontal. But in order to do that, you need a whole financial and technical apparatus that is not currently there. And so the Global Digital Compact says we commit to building that apparatus. But in today's picture, the working group doesn't necessarily agree on that, because the demands it makes of particularly the most powerful and most resourced actors would be substantial. And so I think that was always going to be problematic. But potentially, you know, the closer we get to actually making statements about what good data governance is or what functional global data governance should be, the more that is going to play out in the discussion.
And perhaps, Lynette, if you could say one thing that really impressed you the most in a positive sense in the meeting, and something that you found was a little bit less positive, or what would be your main highlight, something that you liked to see and something that not so much?
Yeah, well, definitely the thing that impressed me most in a positive sense was that here we all were, and it was possible to get this group of actors together to discuss data governance. It made me feel like the last 10 years of my research has not been wasted, because I've been pushing on the idea that multi-stakeholderism is the only viable way to achieve global data governance. And seeing that made concrete was incredibly encouraging, even though it became clear how political the process is when you try to do that. But that wasn't surprising in any way, right? So just to get that politics on the table, I think we've come a very long way to be able to do that, because we run the risk of living in a world where a very small group of actors do all the data governance. And it's based on a very simple set of principles that don't really take human rights seriously. You know, so I think getting in a situation where we can wrestle over multi-stakeholderism is a huge achievement and a huge positive. And I hope that we can continue doing that and achieve things out of that. You know, and then I guess the thing that was most difficult was exactly the flip side of that. Was, of course, the power dynamics arriving in the room, certain actors feeling not exactly threatened, but asserting themselves about what data governance should be and about the extent to which it can be multi-stakeholder. You know, and that was tough. That was really tough and will continue to be tough, but it's tough in all international relations currently. It's tough in the UN General Assembly. You know, this is the stuff of intergovernmental relations. And
Absolutely.
we're right in the middle of it.
Yes, we are. And I think you raise a
Um,
good point, because that speaks to the importance of having all the stakeholders in the room and being able to participate. And we know that the UN is under a huge budgetary pressure right now. That means that many of the working group members were not supported to travel to Geneva and
yeah,
be in the room and participate. And that was not what used to happen in previous CSTD working groups, in which we were supported to attend as being working group members. And although there was a huge effort to include online participants, be it members of the group or not, as I mentioned before, it does affect the dynamics in the room, I think, a little bit, if you are just online and you're not able to approach your colleagues, or you're not able to have that coffee during coffee break and then kind of try to fine tune different views. So perhaps you could share a little bit your views about this different dynamics of those who are present or not in the room. And unfortunately, that will probably affect civil society quite a lot, which is the stakeholder group with less resources to come to
yes.
Geneva in person. And do you think that there will be, how will the group operate now that this first meeting has passed? Will you get together in intersessional meetings perhaps, or maybe you have established an official channel of communication among group members? And after that, I'm going to turn to our audience if you have any questions or comments.
Yeah. Sure. So the UN's liquidity crisis made it hard to even find a digital platform on which we could include the people who are not in the room. There was a very real possibility that people who couldn't be there in person simply would not get to participate, which was very concerning indeed. As it is, as you correctly say, it renders the playing field really unequal for those in the discussion. There were a number of states who were online as well. So it wasn't as unequal as I think it will become over the course of the maybe 5 or 6 meetings we're going to have, which are not all scheduled yet. We're having the next one in early July. But I think that the main thing I noticed was that it was incredibly demanding of the people who were online to pay attention for what was first, I think, like an 8-hour day, and then the second day was like a 5-hour day. That's, particularly post-pandemic, all of us have trouble paying attention fully for that amount of time online. So definitely some were more equal than others. And if you're an online participant, you have to be very, very committed to get your voice heard. And I noticed that the queue online stretched on, whereas if you were in the room, you could be heard a lot faster. So I think that incentivizes people to try to be in the room, and some are still not going to be able to, so that's very tough. That's very tough. And I would much rather that we could all be there on a more equal footing. I was very fortunate that I could be in the room because of a European research grant. So I realized that not everybody's going to be as lucky.
Yes, absolutely. As being online, I saw that people would really take a long time to be heard, and it's kind of natural because if you are facilitating a meeting, you do feel the pressure of those who are in front of you, so that dynamics becomes unequal and you don't have the chance to interact during breaks. So that changes. Let me turn to our audience a little bit. Perhaps you have some comments, some questions, anything that you would like to raise. At this point, this first block of the session was more dedicated to what is. Then in the next one, we're going to look a little bit into the future of the working group, but we would be really happy to hear your comments, your concerns, or your questions. Over to you. You have a button in the bottom, and you can use it to raise your hand. Or just unmute.
Maybe I could ask if we have anyone in the group online who have been part of one of these processes and how that compares. You were comparing to your previous experience. I would be interested if anyone else has thoughts.
That's a good question. I know that we all have some level of experience with the UN processes.
Mm.
I am trying to find the chat, but see if we have any. Okay, public chat, I found it. It's a new platform, so we're still getting used to it too. But yeah, I found the chat, but I don't see any questions. We're being shy at the moment. I see the list. I know you guys. I know that many of you have a deep knowledge on what we're talking about. Yes, we have a first comment. James Gordon from Brazil. Good morning and good afternoon for all. Are you following the work of BRICS in the context of data economy and data governance? The Brazil's presidency has submitted a proposal about this topic. Lennon.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I would say that in the room, a lot of this comes back to the multi-stakeholder context, where the countries that are present are definitely speaking up about their domestic agendas and about their regional agendas. And those are slowly becoming clear, even in the discussion about the TOR and the working plan for the group. We're starting to see sort of alliances emerge. We're seeing common interests, and those are very often based on national and regional documents that are already accessible. So if you want to have a sense of where countries are coming from, I think checking those policy documents is definitely a good idea.
Yes, absolutely. And we could feel this regional dynamics emerging as well. Brazil was very vocal in the room, and we're trying to bridge different positions, Indonesia as well, Peru. So that there were countries, especially on the development side, that were trying to act and participate with a more common position and voice, trying to mainstream development, which was an issue that kind of surprised me, because to me, from the outset, the mandate is very clear that development is the key concern, is the pivotal issue that is going to structure all the discussion around it. But it seemed to me, at least in the beginning, that was sliding a little bit. And I felt like developing countries had to assert themselves a little bit to bring it back to the center where it should be, as per the mandate that was given.
Yes, but I mean, we're dropping a major economic good into a discussion about development, and we don't usually do that. It's interesting. This is the first development discussion I've been in about 20, 25 years, where such a huge financial object is in play or economic object is in play. And it was interesting to see that, because normally development discussions go round and round, and eventually we get to a consensus, and it's in line with where we started off, you know. And I think the data governance working group could go in almost any direction because of the incentives in play. And people were arguing passionately about the importance of data for their economies, but in really different ways, you know, particularly as a way to build a future as an economy. And so I think there are really different interests in play that make this a little bit different from your classic development discussion.
Yes, absolutely. James just have referenced us to a document that has been published by BRICS on this issue. And the upcoming BRICS meeting is going to be a very important moment for us to try to align positions better to in between. And looking to the future, perhaps we can start a discussion about what the future holds for the working group, because the working group is expected to report on its progress to the General Assembly, and the mandate says no later than the 81st session, including the follow-ups, recommendations that it may have. But what kinds of outputs that you think the group is expected to produce? There was a discussion on format, for example, if the group would present a final report, or if it should split its outcomes into chunks that are a little bit more manageable, like policy briefs. And there was a little bit of discussion about the substance as well, which was something that I thought would appear later, but there are countries that really came forward and were clear in what they are expecting to see in such an outcome document. What were your feelings about that?
Yeah, I mean, several times during the meetings last week, it felt as if we'd reached a consensus on what the output should be, but then that consensus receded. So I would say that's not fully decided yet. There's a strong proposal about trying to produce other outputs than just a report to UNGA, to the UN General Assembly, which seems entirely reasonable. That's going to and fro between a discussion of whether those sub-reports should be the report itself, whether it should come in the form of various policy statements about different aspects of data, or whether those should be sort of side reports that make the work more accessible to different actors and make it more digestible. Because it's possible that if the working group produces a very long advice, that this might not be particularly, you know, user-friendly for those with different interests. So I think both positions are reasonable, but we didn't get anywhere with making a final decision on that yet.
And in your view, what are the key issues that, of course, this is a personal view, but what are the key issues that this group should necessarily address to ensure that it fulfills the mandate that has been given by the General Assembly, even if broadly?
Yeah, so I think I would predict that there's going to be a push to turn the discussion mainly towards the technical side of data governance, and to think about interoperability as a general good that we can agree on, and that we assume it relates to certain common objects of consensus. What I would love to see is the discussion distinguish between sort of top-level concerns of interoperability, where we probably all agree on the functionality of the system, versus issues of public interest, which are going to differ radically per region, per country, per actor. So people thinking about research data are going to care differently about data governance than people thinking about health data. health data sharing, on pandemics, and they're going to think differently about data governance than people thinking about data as an asset that behaves, or insights as an asset that behave like, financial markets, basically. So, and there are almost infinite examples, right, in there. So what would make me happy, and what I proposed in the working group actually, was that we distinguish a category of public interest data, and that we report back on that, on how to think about what constitutes public interest data, and what that category might mean for governance, whether governance differs when we move towards public interest data. Because, for instance, some developing countries are very interested in the notion of data sovereignty and digital sovereignty, which are necessarily quite different things. Also, infrastructural sovereignty came up. And when we think about that, we think about the public sector as much as we do about the private sector. And we think about countries' ability to run their own infrastructures, which would take, as I said earlier, a lot of capacity building, technical assistance, and finance, resource transfers. And so if we think about public interest data, we get a very different picture of what we might try to do as a working group. And I think it's appropriate to think along both lines at once, right? Because we want a functioning digital economy, but we also want functioning digital public services and public goods. And I think if we can only think about data as a commodity, we will miss that side of building sovereignty, building sovereign infrastructure, being able to determine what happens to domestic data on a domestic basis. And this is, in fact, a working group on data governance at all levels. It's right there in the rubric. So if we're thinking about all levels, we're going far beyond international transfers and interoperability. We're also thinking about how the SDGs, for instance, are carried out on the national level, and how data infrastructures and processes can facilitate countries to do that in ways that they can't currently.
It seems that necessarily there will be a lot of disagreements as well, and some of the countries mentioned that they believe it will not be possible to produce any recommendations, but perhaps come up with a few conclusions or suggestions or frameworks. And there was a discussion on whether the working group should capture only points that are consensus among all group members, but also disagreements. And it seemed to me, at least as an observer, that there is a general idea that it's important to capture these disagreements as well, but it's one of the issues that it's not yet resolved, if I understood.
Yeah. No, this was one of the big processual issues that are also substantive, because it relates to what we mean by multi-stakeholderism with regard to data governance. So if we have a consensus-based process, only a consensus-based process, then that will play to the interests of those who want to go to the highest possible and the most technical possible level about data as an economic good and about interoperability, I would predict. And if we go to a process that acknowledges a lack of consensus on certain issues, I think we might then have an easier time talking, Renata's joined, talking about data as a public good, infrastructure as a public concern, and public interest data.
Yes, absolutely. And it seemed to me that there's also a lack of clear understanding about what is the deadline for this group to deliver something, because the mandate talks about the 81st session, but is it the beginning? Is it at the end? What will be the path forward for a final output of this working group once it's finalized? Who will approve it and where it will be sent to? Is it something that is clear to working group members?
Shall I pass to Renata, who hasn't got to speak yet?
Hello, Renata.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your, current location. I had like a glitch because I had like noted my calendar previously agreed time, and I didn't update it. Big mistake from my side, but I'm here. So it is subject to interpretation. Marilia, we could interpret it in different ways. Putting the legal hat on, we have a mandate and we have one requirement, but there's nowhere in the mandate that says that the mandate is completed by the action indicated there. The only thing that is indicated is that we need to report to provide at least an update on the state of the dialogue by the 81st Assembly. It doesn't say it ends here. It doesn't say like by the 81st Assembly, you will provide a complete report and sets of actions. It says like, you have to update us. How is it going? What have you found? Where are the frictions? And can you, in the meantime, from the information that you have gathered from the stakeholders at all levels, which is a massive piece of work, could you tell us, like more or less, if you have reached any, general agreement on recommendations that you can point at for states to follow? So some of the members of the working group interpreted it as the deadline and that the deliverable is a report. If you read the text carefully, that's not my interpretation. My interpretation is that the intention, the core of this working group is a dialogue at all levels, and at all levels is a lot. And that's why so many UN agencies have been invited to the process. Now, the important thing is how we play it, because I think that we need to be aware of the parallel political timeline, and that there will be like changes in leadership in the main powers around us, and extending it and just establishing the the 81st Assembly as General Assembly as a reporting point, a checkpoint on the mandate of the working group can play in our favor, because it can permit less rushed analysis, building trust across the process and engaging as many stakeholders as possible. And I see the process as well as an educational process for many countries that are not where data governance is not on top of their priorities, and I think that this will will make it, the end result will be better. But that's my personal interpretation, and other interpretations say like it's the end of the mandate. Other interpretations, the moment where the General Assembly is gathering. Others interpret as the end, because it's not the beginning of the 81st Assembly, but anything happening during that year. And my interpretation is far more extended by reading the text. Indicating that it will be just that reporting is just a milestone within our mandate.
And that's an excellent point that you raised, Anata, with regards to the awareness raising importance of this process. Because if we look at the countries that were participating in the working group, they are, and other stakeholders as well, but the countries, they are at very different levels when it comes to how they appropriate the topic of data governance. So it is important, and that's one of the reasons why we're organizing this. So this online series of discussions is to involve as many people as possible. And it seems to me that the leadership, the chair, the vice chairs, they are also very open to involve other stakeholders and observers into the process. They were allowed in the meeting room. We are receiving the documents, as I mentioned in the beginning. So the more people that we manage to involve in this process, I think the stronger it will be from all stakeholder groups. So that's a very, very good point. And Nata, let me just ask you a question that I asked Linet before, which is a very open question, perhaps that we will allow you to bring some of the views that you had to share in relation to this topic, which is what to you were the main highlights, positive and negative, of this first meeting? What were the things that impressed you like the most positively, and also something that you didn't expect that could have been better?
First positive was the natural alignment of global majority. It was not I didn't see any conflicting views from the countries represented in the room and outside the room from the global majority, the ones that have the most at stake in the situation, and a smooth coordination of those present to push for to push to preserve the core of our mandate. and defending issues like inclusion, equity, and so on. Another positive is precisely the openness that you highlighted, that is not a closed doors discussion, but loyal to the mandate. It is what we are doing is basically designing a dialogue that should take, should take this conversation to as many places as possible, and as many specialized areas as possible. The negatives is an undeniable lack of resources, and a really harm organization that used to play like such relevant dialogue, really bare bones management, a meeting that in the past would be like supported by simultaneous translation, flexibility of time, plentiful of resources, a team allocated in the area to support the secretariat, and support to civil society to even attend the meetings. I mean, that has been scrapped. And it is not lack of willingness, it is reality given the cash flow crisis that the UN is into. And that's very sad, because it is such an important topic that is going to shape the future or in the process of, digital industrial policy of so many countries. And it's a great space to shape those policies. And I mean, and an organization like UNCTAD needs resources for that, to make it really, to make participation meaningful, to equip the chair and the vice chairs with all the staff that they need, and then to make sure that the outcomes are going to be not they are adopting a practice that is to push all the work to us. And that's not the way that it used to work. And it's not only in this process, it's in other processes of the UN, every responsibility of drafting and crafting is pushed to civil society. And it's not that this political funding crisis hasn't impacted civil society and academia. There's austerity all over the place, so we are outnumbered and out of resources in comparison to other stakeholders. So companies have that didn't affect them. And governments always have permanent staff. So what it enables is an ecosystem where those with the most resources can have the most of the influence given the resources constraints. And the fourth negative aspect, I will say, is this fuzziness and lack of clarity on what we are supposed to do. I would have expected that would have been top down. That sometimes it's okay top down. Sometimes top down helps processes to move forward. So telling us this is your frame. This is in the text. This is our interpretation of the text. Unless it's a major disagreement that is justified, that is truly justified, let's move on. And that was not the case. We are still, stuck in the discussion of one word here, one date here, and the lack of clarity around the rules of the game is annoying. It is because every issue will be a fight. How long are we supposed to work? What is our the mandate that we are supposed to fulfill? And where are we holding the meetings and when? So that will delay the work further and dilute the resources even further. And that's one of the arguments I want to push for, the extension of the mandate until the dialogue has been fulfilled. And the person that can say if the dialogue has been fulfilled is the UN General Assembly, nobody else, in my opinion.
Thank you, Renata. Perhaps let's connect this process with other processes that are happening in parallel. And I think that will that will touch upon the good question that was asked by Jacqueline in the chat. This mandates of this working group, it relates to other conversations happening in parallel in the UN, such as the working group for DPI safeguards. Perhaps it will relate to the high-level panel on AI. There will be the WSIS plus 20 review process, and it's not very clear, as Jacqueline mentioned, how the GDC connects with WSIS plus 10 and how this working group will fit into that discussion. Would you have any views that will help us put all these different pieces of the puzzle in a coherent map? And we have so many discussions in parallel right now. You're muted, Renata.
Do you remember a map that was done like 1 decade and a half, if not more ago, by Joanna Baron, Lea Kaspar, and others that they used to have they mapped the playing field, and they mapped the different processes in a calendar that span 24 months. And all civil society members, I will try to look at the link and share it here, and all civil society members could know what was happening at every stage. I think that something combined with a topic mapping would be extremely useful, because we are spread too thin across so many processes. And on top of that, we have to manage our programs. There's very few organizations that have dedicated funding and staff just to follow these processes. And that could be a tool. I cannot. I think that the other thing would be to encourage the United Nations to try to group the meetings in a way that we do not come and go, but to group the meetings around things that are already happening. So it is not so if we need to be in person, and I have to say that in these kind of negotiations, in person really counts, because it's so easy to shut you down when you are online. And it's harder, to get rid of you when you are in the room and you can follow the delegates to coffee and so on. I think that would be a great way that it would be a key intervention of the United Nations if they can coordinate themselves. And the third thing is to delegate trust. So to offer input and delegate, in key people in our communities, and report back. I think that this that the Diplo Foundation is doing is excellent because of that. I think that many times we have no time to sit down. I wouldn't have time to sit down 2 days in every process. And having these spaces of sharing and accountability is very useful, and collaboration, of course.
Lynette, perhaps from your perspective, more specifically with the WSIS plus 20, which is just around the corner, it seems like there is an obvious relation there, data, as we were discussing in the beginning of the conversation, such as an enabler of not only other objectives of the GDC, but also some of the WSIS action lines. Are you aware of any effort to try to connect the dots coming from the UN or from different stakeholder groups?
I mean, yeah, obviously WSIS was mentioned in our meeting last week in Geneva. I think it forms an important chunk of the thinking that went into the Global Digital Compact in the first place. And it articulates principles and I think also methods of inclusion that are really important to keep a hold of. I mean, I think I watched Renata doing the same thing in the meeting, was pushing as hard as possible on those principles of inclusiveness, and saying that unless we can follow that line of thinking that comes out of WSIS, then we're not doing our jobs, right? Regardless of the incentives of actors currently. So that was the main struggle that I saw, was to keep to the line that we've been working on for decades, as opposed to changing it to make it into something much simpler and more technical.
Yes, and let me ask you, but also ask everyone in the group, because I know that we have participants who are also very well connected and working in their organizations in this topic. Are you aware of any strategy or opportunities for outreach I was talking to Renata when we were organizing this meeting, that we're really concerned that there's so much going on in the world that is so easy and justifiable for our minds to be elsewhere and for us to lose track and attention about this process. But it is so vital to so many things that we are discussing in parallel. So we have Eurodig upcoming next week, which will discuss sovereignty, and data will necessarily be part of the conversation, and AI. And we have the IGF coming, and although the IGF will be a little bit more succinct in terms of program this year, are you aware of any outreach opportunities that we could perhaps take advantage of? And again, question to you too, but also to the whole group of attendees. If you have ideas, let us know, drop in the chat or use your microphone. Do you have any plans or organizations? Are you organizing sessions in the IGF that will touch upon this topic by any chance?
Go ahead,
If
Renata.
there's no hand, if there's no hand, very quickly, at the Open Knowledge Foundation, we are like at least monitoring fairly good the digital public infrastructure component. And we are not involved in everything, but aware of everything that is happening. And we are going to probably be at the Digital Public Goods Alliance Summit, and to a couple of other spaces where it including the IGF dedicated discussions on digital public infrastructure. That can be our contribution.
Thank you, Renata. But thinking about the plan and the timeline for this working group in particular, you mentioned that the next meeting is expected to take place in July, if I'm not mistaken, Lilith mentioned. And what do you expect from this meeting? We have the issue of the TOR, which is still open, which will likely be the first point of this meeting. I didn't have the chance to take a look, but I did receive this morning the revised version of the TOR. So I was very happy to know that actually that the participants that registered for the first meeting there continue to be considered observers in between. So we still continue to receive communications. This is one of the reasons why I would encourage everyone who is attending this meeting and obviously interested in the process to try to register as observers for the next meeting, because if this becomes established practice, you will continue to receive communications intersessionally. This is very important too. But what do you expect for the next meeting?
I am hoping that we can get past the terms of reference discussion, but I'm not sure how I'm interested to see how we're going to do that, given that there are such fundamental disagreements about in whose interest the process should function. I'm interested to hear Renata's response as well, though.
I am hoping to see more active participation of other states. Actually, the meeting was scheduled, the first part of the meeting was scheduled on the 1st of May, and it is like, a national holiday in many, many, many countries. So heavy voices were not present in the room, like for example, government of India and government of Egypt. So it will be more what I expect from the next meeting is more political clarity of where governments stand and to understand the country dynamics and the groups being formed for or against a mandate that let us do our work. And I am also expecting clarity on the duration and a fight, and a fight that will be important to align civil society at least in what the length of the mandate and what we are supposed to deliver. I will not be worried too much if it takes longer if the extension of this discussion will make us have a longer mandate and a more flexible mandate is great. I am afraid of some civil society actors trying to rush to have let's get the work done approach. Let's get the work done is an approach that some like, but when you have such a power imbalance, what work am I supposed to do is a more important question than let's get the work done. I mean, we don't work for McKinsey, We're not paid for efficiency. We are volunteering time from our, public interest institutions because we want this work to be meaningful for development. And it's a big mandate of, consider the data governance at all levels that comes, and it spans from the how we govern the data of very precarious workers working for a transnational platform to health data of autistic kids. So it is a serious business, and I don't want to rush on that. So I hope that the next meeting goes slow and full of frictions, if that let us achieve what we want.
That's a very
I
good
agree.
observation.
Yeah, I think sometimes the frictions are the whole point. We obviously have to come out with an advice to the General Assembly. We will hopefully come out with a bunch of side products that will be useful to lots of different actors around the world. But yeah, I would say my hope is similar to Renata's, that we get to have a substantive discussion and that we address this issue of why we would want not to have a substantive discussion. I think that would be a real achievement.
Absolutely. And as we were discussing, the chair was saying, I'm really happy with the progress, and perhaps those who are not so familiar with how UN discussions take place. I thought it was an excellent opportunity to map the different views in the room and felt the anxiety. What are you here about? What are you anxious about? What you are trying to achieve by being here? So as a chance to get to know each other as members of the working group, I think it was a really valuable opportunity. We have reached the top of the hour. There were a lot of comments of staying in touch and people who want to be engaged in this conversation. Let me just reassure you that we will send you an email when we organize the next webinar of this event series. So it was really nice to have you with us. Thank you so much, Lynette. Thank you, Renata. It was really invaluable to have your perspectives. We will continue in touch, and I would encourage you to also register for the next meeting of the working group as observers. That was really important and eye-opening, and also to increase legitimacy of the process. It's very important to have all of us involved. Thank you very much. Have a good continuation of the day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.